The ChabadPulse podcast discusses serious issues and interviews guests in a free-form, open manner, occasionally touching on adult topics that may be unsuitable for children's ears.
You are listening to the ChabadPulse podcast. What is it like to finally, publicly tell your story of child and adolescent sexual abuse after so many years of keeping it a secret? And what changes can our system and our community make to help survivors and prevent further abuse? Rabbi Avremi Zippel, a Shliach Rabbi Rebbe and a sexual abuse survivor, is in studio with us to answer these questions and more on the ChabadPulse podcast. Hi there, I'm your host, Shalom Nemenev, and you are listening to the ChabadPulse podcast. If you're listening to us for the first time, either because you found us via our entree to social media, or because you found the link on chinfo.com, cryoninfo.com, welcome. We are so glad you decided to join us. I hope you'll enjoy the following episode, and I hope you'll go listen to our back episodes, or our past episodes. You can do that by visiting ChabadPulse.com or by searching ChabadPulse, no spaces, on any music or podcast streaming platform or on YouTube. We've got some great ones, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. If you're already a regular listener, we sincerely thank you for your continued support and your continued patience as we work to become more consistent in our posting schedule. You can stay tuned on that process and get the latest updates and sneak peeks into future episodes by following us on Instagram at ChabadPulse. On the podcast this week, we have a conversation with Rabbi Avremi Zippel. Rami is a Shliach Rabbi in Utah. He's a class and a campmate of mine. He's my age. And he's a person who recently went public with his experience of sexual abuse as a child and adolescent. So it was a big story. It went viral. It's possible you heard about it already. And you can find the details of that experience, including the story of how and why he came forward, by reading the original interview he did with the Utah newspaper Deseret News. We're going to link to that article in the description below, podcast description on YouTube and on podcast platforms. Avremi coming forward was a big shock to me personally. I think to most people who knew him, because I think most people, and this is wrong of most people, including me, have a picture in their head of what someone who suffered from child sexual abuse looks like. We assume a level of dysfunction. And again, none of this is fair, and none of this is based on anything but our own, ignorant assumptions. And Avremi does not fit that category. Avremi is a person who went through the system. Avremi is a Shliach Rebbe. He's, by all accounts, a success, and he suffered from this. He experienced this. So it was a shock. It was a shock to all of us. And hearing his story and talking to him, it drives home the point that, sexual abuse doesn't always leave publicly visible scars. And more importantly, it's a reminder that we as a community don't truly understand the scope, the depth of this issue that we have to deal with. Our conversation wasn't about the details of his abuse or recovery. That's already been covered by people more qualified than I, including in a conversation with the Shliach Rabbi Peretz Chaim. He has a podcast called A New Conversation with Chani and Peretz, and Rabbi Zippel did a conversation with him that went more in depth on the, nuts and bolts of the abuse and recovery process. I found it fascinating, and I think you should listen to it too if you're interested. We're going to link to that also in the episode description, again, on the podcast platform of your choice or YouTube. Instead, we focused on the community reaction and how that figured into his decision to come forward, what it's actually been like, and the ways he thinks we can and should be doing better to address this issue. I think it's one of the more, despite the painful subject matter, it was a very interesting interview, and I hope you'll feel the same. So without further ado, let's get started. It is an honor to welcome to the show Rabbi Avremi Zippel, Shliach Rebbe in Salt Lake City. Welcome, Avremi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
I'm happy to.
So we're here to talk about a heavy topic. It's heavier than most things we talk about here, but it's as important as any of them, more important than most of them, I'd say. For people who don't know, Rabbi Zippel is a survivor of sexual abuse and came out with this story a couple of months ago. Went public, it went viral, I guess, in some ways.
I guess so. Yeah, that's a fair thing to say, I guess.
Starting with an original article in the Deseret News that we're going to link in the description of this podcast, that you can go over the details, because we're not going to be going over those details here. That's been covered by people more qualified than me in a more thorough way. We're here to talk about really the way your experience has, the way it relates to our community and the way our community deals with things like this and your experiences with that. So let's start from the very beginning. From the beginning of you coming forward.
Beginning.
Yeah, of you coming forward.
Sure.
When you started seriously thinking about it, how much did the reaction of the community, your friends, your family, how much was that weighing on you as a factor?
I would say it was by far the strongest factor, no question. I would split up friends and family. Obviously, my family was aware of it at a pretty early stage.
But there's levels in family. There's your
right,
family,
right. So when you think about cousins and the like, sure.
Right.
It was the scariest thing in the world. Specifically when I thought about, my classmates in yeshiva and people on Kingston Avenue and fellow shluchim and, Lubavitchers who are complete and total strangers, how would it be taken? It was daunting. I think for me, the most daunting thing was when I would engage in this thought process and I would think to myself, whenever somebody finds himself in a situation like this, you want to receive counsel from people who have gone through this before you. And so you think to yourself, who should I call? Which fellow Lubavitcher survivor of sexual abuse should I talk to about this? And then it kind of, you come to the conclusion that you don't really have anybody to talk to, and that's that's the daunting part.
Wow.
Which was a very profound realization for me in a sense. I don't think I was the first Lubavitcher to be sexually abused. I think I might be one of the more visible ones at this point.
I can just say from my perspective is that I think you're one of the first people who sort of went all the way through the system and are considered success stories to come forward with a story like this.
Baruch Hashem. I mean, so I'll tell you an interesting anecdote, Shalom Bar. There was a period in time, roughly about a year, like a little bit less than a year, and so I went to the police and things really got off the ground in. Last year, Erev Pesach, so almost a year ago now. My abuser was arrested on Erev Pesach, literally a few hours before Seder. And then the story came out on Rosh Chodesh, Adar Aleph of this year. So about, 10 and a half months. And in those 10 and a half months, I was kind of had a foot in either world. And I was telling some people. And so I had a conversation with a Lubavitcher Rav, a Mashpia, a Selach Rav of sorts. And I asked him what he thought I should do, and he says, I don't know what to tell you. I can't take it on my own shoulders to tell you to go forward with this because I don't know what the reaction will be. So I was frustrated with that. We all want to do things and get a pat on the back and an attaboy, like, yeah, do it, right. And that wasn't what he was saying. So I said to him, I got to ask you a question. It's my opinion, it's my projection, I guess, that in our meistus there are, hundreds of kids, dozens of kids that are, I said hundreds, that are survivors of sexual abuse. Do you agree with me? So he says, I disagree with you. If you think there's hundreds, I think there's thousands. Whatever you think the number is, I think it's higher. So I said, okay, so we understand each other over here. So what are we going to do about that? He said, I don't know, but I'm not telling you that, just because there's a calamity doesn't mean that this is the way to address the calamity.
Right.
Fine. Then, one of the first people that I told in the Lubavitch world, I told a teacher of mine from yeshiva. I did the whole thing. Zal, shlichus, smicha, got married, went on shlichus. And so I called one of my mashpiyim. This was a person that I was extremely close to. One of the people who was probably the hardest to keep it a secret from when I was in Zal. And so I called him, and it all tumbled out. And I told him everything. And so it's quiet for a moment, and he says to me, I'll never forget his initial reaction. He says, wow, you were not the person I thought I'd hear this from.
Wow.
To me, it was
saying it explicitly.
Yeah, to me, that was like, okay, that's a cute sentiment, but that's unfair. There's, and I guess what really motivated me to do this was this perception that, survivors of sexual abuse by typically or we use sexual abuse as an excuse for failures in life. Have rachmanis on them. You know what they went through as a child. Like, that's why they can't cut it. That's why they can't make it. That's why X, Y, and Z. And why can't we shift that? And I think that as a result of that, because we're so used to that being a crutch, people are hesitant to come forward about their own abuse because they think to themselves, so who does that lump me in with? That lumps me in with all the excuse guys. I'm not an excuse guy. Look at me. I'm making a life for myself. And so, all of these things together really motivated the decision to come forward. I will be honest, up until 48 hours after the article came out, I was still scared to death, what the reaction would be. At this point, Baruch Hashem, it's been so overwhelmingly positive, and I still have this feeling that at some point somebody's going to come out with a scathing, how dare you, how could you have, etc. But in the meantime, the reaction has been amazing.
What was the specific thing you were scared of, like in your nightmares? What was an incident or something telling something that was scaring you?
It's an excellent question. I thought to myself, what am I doing wrong? For some reason, I always had this perception that the negative reaction would be along the lines of you should go and see somebody and it should be taken care of. It's interesting to use the words, to say the word sexual abuse so freely, because it's not part of our lexicon, and I don't know if that's a bad thing. I don't know if for better or for worse, it's the reality. But it's even for me that I've spoken about sexual abuse to my shrink and to the cops and to everybody and their cousins. When I say it in the context of of fellow Lubavitchers, it's still a little unnatural.
It's when I was having this discussion, and when I'm writing materials about this, and it's tempting to euphemize things.
Yeah,
you're going to say abuse, childhood abuse,
CSA.
Yeah, It's tempting to not it's the S word.
Yeah.
It's an uncomfortable word for us to use.
Absolutely. So I at no point in this process did I ever go through a phase where I want to burn down Lubavitch and burn down my childhood and be a renegade and change everything. And I think there is a beauty to a sensitivity, where the term sexual abuse is not thrown around so frequently. At the same time, I wonder if an inability to understand really what sexual abuse is, may have been a factor in how long it went on for me.
I would again, I'm not an expert
at
all, but I'd wager that our inability to talk about these topics at all leads to a whole host of issues.
Sure.
And for sure, people who are getting abused and aren't able to come forward about it.
Sure. I think about this a lot. That if you would go into a Masifta, Lubavitch Masifta today, any Masifta, in town, out of town, whatever it is, and you get up in front of a bunch of 14, 15, 16-year-olds, and you say, can anybody here, by raise of hand, define for me what is the term sexual abuse? How would you define it? 75% of the room would go crimson, would blush to death. And the other 25% would sit in their chairs uncomfortably. That's not a bad thing per se, because they're not used to the term. And in a certain sense, there's a beauty and there's an innocence to that. But what if one of those kids is going through that and doesn't know what that means and what they're supposed to do with that? That's something which I think about. And I think about me at 14, 15, 16 that didn't know the definition of that term. I would have never used that term, God forbid. But and so in a certain sense, there is a beauty to the purity of it. But at the same time, it's just I wonder at times, what can be done to help those that are stuck in the middle of this.
So we'll get to that later. I think
Sure.
It's definitely like what can be done. I think is the reason we're here,
because we're existential question right now. Right.
What can be done in general about the world? That's why we're here. That's why we're Lubavitch.
Sure.
What can be done?
Sure.
But we'll get to that a little later. So you're scared of a reaction that doesn't materialize. What is the reaction actually like?
So it's the first time I'm going to take the conversation down this road, and it's Shalom, about your audience is we talked about it, it's pretty specific, and I think that I think your audience is up for hearing this. So I'd put the reaction into three camps, into three different reactions. One reaction were those who came forward without being able to relate to it. All the messages that began with, I have no idea what you're going through. I was chuckling with my mother today because she was pulling up an old text message. People would send me and my parents their condolences.
Condolences.
Which I get it. Like, if your English vocabulary isn't that diverse, when someone's going through a hard time, you send them condolences. Thank God no one needed condolences. But so there was, and that was amazing. People people you don't know, people you knew 20 years ago. Between me and my wife and my parents, the people that came forward to share their love and support, for lack of a better term, and their comfort, their attempt. Again, we chuckle about condolences, but they're wanting to be of support and of nichum, for lack of a better term.
They want to be there for you.
Right. That takes your breath away. And it still comes in. It's amazing. And people find the article later, whatever it is. That was amazing. And then there's kind of the second wave. You bump into people on the streets, and their attitude is one of, I feel really bad. I wanted to text you. I just didn't know what to say. What do you say to a person going through that? So I just want to let you know, I thought of you in the moment, and I wanted to pick up the phone and call or text, just didn't know how to put it into words. And so that is amazing.
Just,
and
that just a short thing. When I reached out to you to ask you to come on the show, I must have rewritten that message probably 12 times. People just don't know, and I can put myself in that too.
All right.
I'm a writer. In my day-to-day life.
No,
I didn't know how to phrase the message.
My wife was like getting all, not upset, but she was like all weirded out. That night when it came out, I was getting from a lot of people. I was getting emojis, like
emojis,
the muscle emoji, like the muscle emoji, and like the muscle emoji, and like the kissing face emoji.
That's amazing.
And I was like, I get it. Like they don't know what to say, so it's like, you're strong, love you, like in emojis, fine. So I just sent them back the kissing face emoji. So anyways, that's all kind of one camp.
That's one camp.
The second camp is fellow Lubavitchers, shluchim, non-shluchim, whoever it is, Yidden, that came forward with their own abuse. The first 6 hours of that was remarkable, because you think you're the only one in the world. And it's like, no, look at this. Here's one, and here's one, and here's one. After 6 hours, it went from remarkable to actually depressing. Like, wow, I thought it was the only one. Not only am I not the only one,
but we have a real crisis.
There's hundreds. There's no end in sight. And after you get past depressing, then it kind of comes to a point where you find people you can talk to about it, and you find people who have this common resolve, and you find that indeed there's an awareness as to the gravity of the issue and as to the enormity of the issue, and people are in lockstep. People get this, and so the second camp is the camp of fellow survivors, which grows. Again, unfortunately, but remarkably by the day, and people are coming forward. And so this is not my first time in Crown Heights since the article came out. I was here for a Shabbaton 4 or 5 weeks ago. That was the most surreal experience in the world. Walking up and down Kingston Avenue with a group of people from Salt Lake City, and people coming over just like, complete and total strangers. I was abused when I was 14 and just running off across the street. Like,
wow.
It really is like there's like this secret society, and people feel like, one person I can tell, and I want to finally unload that. And so that's also amazing, sadly amazing. And there's so much to be done amazing, but it's amazing. The third camp, and this is kind of the novelty that I want to talk about. The third camp weren't people that were at all malicious or negative or harmful or rude
in their intentions.
Right. Or even in their words. But the third camp were people who didn't directly communicate, but who, talked about the story online in a way to further their own agenda. So let me try to, explain what I mean for a second. I see this in the larger world. So we live in a society, especially now in this country, where everything is politicized. And so everything good or bad immediately has something it falls into. So there's a shooting in a school, before the bodies are cold. Gun control, we need to give the NRA, blah, 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 blah. And on the flip side, there's a border town in Texas, and an undocumented immigrant, kills somebody, and right there, build the wall, build, do we know anything about the poor person who was killed? Is there a family? Everything is immediately spun, in our society, our media.
Every tragedy is an opportunity for something.
Exactly, and before the family has a chance to get their act together, and let's give the family some dignity and some space and some, the ability to grieve. No, we're spinning it right away. It's spun into, how can this story further my agenda? So the story was very widely discussed online. I get it. In the Lubavitch community, the Jewish community. So the people who took the story And again, wow, this is real bravery. Halavai, we should show such bravery to those who come forward in our own community about the abusers in our own community. Like, that was a little hurtful. Because to me, the message was, thank you for your contribution to society. We will use part of that to further our agenda, and the rest of it is useless to us. So shkoyach. And then you go into the depths of the Facebook comments, the hypotheticals. What would have happened if he would have been abused by a mashpia? Would people be lining up to? Well,
that's literally a sayawal comment that I saw 10 minutes ago.
But I wasn't abused by a mashpia. Like, have you ever gone to a cancer survivor and say, have you ever thought what would have happened if you had had kidney failure? What would have happened? I don't know. I was given a set of circumstances to deal with in my own life, and I did. It's not something that as a survivor you sit back and think about. Well, my life is interesting because of this set of circumstances. I wonder what it would have been like different. You think of what it would have been like different if I would have never been abused, but not, what if my abuser would have been this? What if I would have been hit by a car? It's just not the road you go down. And so those were, I wouldn't say they were painful, but those were sad. It was sad that, even in our community, tragedy and a conversation like this, which I agree, let me be very clear. Sexual abuse within our community, being perpetrated by members of our community is a serious problem and one that needs to be dealt with. But it was sad to me that society is in a place where we can't even take a breath for a minute and be like, this is sad. Let's acknowledge this. Let's acknowledge this is sad. Then let's talk about it. Let's take some time and use this conversation, use this episode to further conversation about something else. Instead, right away, it's like, there's this story, let me chop it up into little pieces, take what I can and leave the rest. And that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate when I think about other people who observe this story and think about their own path to come forward. I hope that reaction that they see from the bubble doesn't back them off.
I mean, because you're telling your story and you're hoping to have a positive impact.
Correct.
And people are taking your story and, turning it not positive,
right.
to say the least.
And the only thing that, to me, the most, I'll just say this. Before I went public, it required a lot of, self-determination that you're doing this, you're going to be okay with your decision if the whole world stands against you. You're not doing this to garner public sympathy. You're doing this because you think it's the right thing to do, regardless of what people think. So, I don't need complete and total adoration. And those comments don't detract from my willingness to come forward. What I'm concerned about is what it does to others.
Right.
So if somebody else sees this entire episode and is like, I tell my story, but then I'm going to get lynched by the commentators, on social media and all the talking heads in the Frum community. Well, this story gets a 7 because because blah 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 blah, and we can't give it full credit because blah.
Wow.
And why would you do that?
So you're hoping that people who listen to this and who encounter your story, people who you hope will be helped by it, they should absorb a message from you that despite that negativity, you think it was still worth it.
The negativity to me was not even a drop in the bucket. The negativity to me was more of a social experiment.
Right.
So the Lubavitch community who came forward directly were spectacular. They are. They continue to be. It's just that slice, which is just interesting. It's an interesting social experiment to me.
They say that I think 90% of internet comments are left by 1% of the population.
That makes about sense.
It's not representative.
Right?
Of people.
Totally.
So there's another community, another group of people that was very intimately affected by this, and that's your actual community as a shliach. You're a leadership figure, you're an authority figure, you're a rabbi. When you come forward with that story, what's the reaction from them like?
My particular situation is made even stranger by the fact that I'm a shliach to a community that have known me since I was 11 months old. So there were two different reactions in the community. Certain people who knew me at that age still have a hard time making eye contact. They can't.
Do you think they feel guilty?
A few of them, to some, people who really knew me well as a kid, I got a bunch of messages, how could I have missed it, which is for a different discussion.
Right.
But for those people, it's difficult. It's difficult to have known that, you were there while it was going on. For the people who I know kind of in this later part of my life, who I met as a shliach, who have come to town whilst I was there on shlichus, I would say this to fellow shluchim and shluchas, and and it's something which I deeply believe in. People appreciate people. Human beings appreciate fellow human beings. Nobody wants to associate themselves. No one feels comfortable, in my opinion, with somebody who's perfect, because there's a certain distance that perfection creates, because you're perfect and I'm not. So how much can we even have in common? When you go forward about something like this, and you make a point to talk about your struggles and your hardships and difficulties in life, people relate to that. People see you as as a common human being. You've got your stuff and I've got my stuff, and we've all got our stuff, and we all fight the good fight and live to fight another day. And so, the reaction in town and kind of the ripple effect that it's had as a result of that has been amazing. People have really connected with the story. I think people see you in a different light. Now, that's not to say that, as a shliach or a shlucha, you should be routinely discussing your shortcomings with your community. Obviously there's a healthy balance, but, in a certain sense, people appreciate real human beings who struggle.
Don't hide the important parts of your life from your community.
Right, exactly. And even when it's painful, that's been my experience, and I would tell that, and I do tell that to shluchim. If you've gone through something in life, you have nothing to hide. You have nothing to be ashamed of. In that sense, your community sees you. You're another one, and you're another common mortal, and they love you even more for that.
That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah,
that's,
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem.
So this is more of a more difficult question. Looking back at your whole experience, and especially now that you've been receiving these messages and being told from other survivors who now see you as someone they can talk to, you know a lot more. I think you have a lot better idea of the scope of the problem in our community, and I think most people have, including me. Are you mad at the community? I don't know if mad is the right word. Are you angry? Are you upset? Do you have any negative feelings towards authority figures who you think could have done things differently to protect people, to protect you, to protect other people who've survived the kinds of things that you've gone through?
Wow. So this is going to sound very lofty. I'm trying to stay off of anger. No, I mean that in the sense of, it's a pretty careful path you need to walk. First of all, from a criminal justice standpoint, you can't go into this looking for a pound of flesh. You need to go into this with a healthy attitude. You can't be needing to bring retribution on the head of your abuser and go scorched earth to get that. You need to put your trust in the system and let it happen. I think to a lesser extent, you need to employ that same attitude when it comes to making change within the community. I'm a very firm believer, and this has only been, significantly reinforced by conversations with fellow survivors. Being a survivor of sexual abuse is something you cannot relate to unless you went through it. Period. It's that simple. So, I will acknowledge, I will put out there, that this is a problem that is woefully under-addressed in our community. There are efforts, there continue to be efforts, to stop this from top down, from getting predators off the streets. And, I don't know the statistics, and I'm sure there are those that do, that's been moderately successful, more successful, it is what it is. I went through our system. I loved our system. I cherished our system in the past, and I continue to cherish our system. I loved my bachar shayarin, for lack of a better term. Yet, as a survivor of sexual abuse going through all that, I did not feel there was a place for me, in a certain sense, and I did not feel that there was an infrastructure for me. And that is something which I think we can change and we must change. It won't happen by burning anybody down. It won't happen by, with pitchforks and protests. work needs to be done from within. And I think that what it requires, for starters, is it requires people who have gone through this to take that sort of role and to create that sort of comfort system for survivors and say, there's a few of us out here who get it. And let's talk. So in answer to your question in terms of, anger and am I upset? No. However, I find that my not being angry does not detract from the fact that I still think it's a woefully under-addressed problem and it needs to be addressed. And so I'm not angry as much as I'm determined that this needs to be addressed. I don't know the dynamic of girls going through this. I'm sure it's a completely different kettle of fish. I've met a few, spoken to a few female survivors, and in brief conversation, it is a completely different experience. But for the Bachrim out there, something needs to be done. And when we say something needs to be done, we don't need to be, building lavish buildings or creating flashy campaigns. A system needs to be in place. Every person needs to feel that their pain is real and believed and legitimized, and there's something to be done for them. And that's what we need to be doing.
So as a Bacher myself, and someone who went through the same system as you did most of the way, being away from home, Sifta Zal, being a Bacher is a very strange, almost like out of planet experience. You're on an island. And I think there's advantages and disadvantages to that. But I think that there's opportunity there too, in this area we're talking about, because you're with new people who didn't know you as from home, and stuff you suffered. I mean, assuming that this abuse happened, as a child and not, currently ongoing in yeshiva itself, which would be a tragedy in itself and a whole different kind of problem. But what would it have looked like for you as a Bacher Masifta or Zal? A scenario, a conversation where you would have come forward and spoken about to somebody you trusted. How could that have happened?
So I'll start with a personal anecdote. When I was on Shlichus, there was a fellow Shliach of mine, a very good friend, who, had a Bacher he was learning with, he was very close with, and the Bacher was going through a hard time, and the Shliach was very personally involved in this Bacher. He was a Masifta Bacher, was like 15, in his, in helping him going through his thing. And it was like, highly classified what
the kid was going through.
What steps were being taken to help the kid. You could have thought, the kid was undergoing, testing in a Navy lab, after a few weeks it came out the kid was seeing a therapist.
Wow.
And it was like, and this, was being protected, by lock and key. Somebody should find out. Now, where I was when all this was going on was still in a different part of my life, pre my own seeing a therapist. But I remember the stigma and the horror. This Bacher is doing this thing and he's seeing a therapist. I'm like, God forbid somebody should know. Now let me answer your question. When I was in Masifta, specifically Masifta and then Zal, and as years went along, the fear, waxed and waned. I was convinced that if the Hanhalas Yeshiva knew about my path, my story, and I got out to them, forget helping, they would have kicked me out.
Kick you out.
Absolutely. No question. This was before I understood the very basic concepts of consent, and of the criminal element of it. What if we could tell our Bachrim that, you could be comfortable telling your mashpia, whoever it is, there's a figure in yeshiva that you can share any concern with, and they will get you the help that you need. Some of that help might involve seeing a therapist.
Which is also not so bad.
It is what it is. I feel like that's the infrastructure that we need to be putting in place. I feel like we really need to be telling our Bachrim, and this is a larger conversation because it starts with the messages that we teach our kids at home, way before they leave home. But, I think you make a very good point. When you are in yeshiva out of town, you really are on an island. There's a certain attachment, and you learn to create a healthy environment for yourself within yeshiva, and you hope that between the Hanhala and your friends or whoever else is involved, you're getting everything you need. can we really make sure that's a reality? Can we really make sure our bachrim are getting everything they need from every standpoint? You know, if I was in Chicago, where it gets minus 35 at night. If a bachur was sleeping in the dorm without a blanket at night, Donald wouldn't tell him to learn an extra perek Tanya before he goes to bed, and in lieu of the blanket.
Right.
You know, are we ready to take upon ourselves that we are ready to provide for our bachrim any need that they have, be it physical, spiritual, or emotional, or mental health related? And that's really, you know, the dream of mine that I'd like to see implemented, you know, for the good of these bachrim is that.
Because as far as I understand it, and again, I'm not far from an expert, but I've read on the subject a little bit. It's not that complicated to get people who've been, you know, abused to come forward. Very often, all you have to do is just ask them.
I would disagree with that.
You would disagree?
I would disagree.
So that's what I'm asking, because you mentioned earlier in the conversation that it was hard to keep it a secret from a specific mashpia.
Yes, right. Not because he had ever asked about it,
Right.
only because there's a certain comfort level that you develop with few people.
Right.
Yes, that's true.
So if they would have asked you straight up.
If he would have asked me straight up, I would have had a really well. That's a tricky question, because if he would have asked me straight up, have you been sexually abused? Going back to what I said
You would think
before,
he was accusing you of something.
I would have not understood what that question meant. I would have said absolutely not.
What if he broke it down to something where you touched inappropriately?
Oh, sure, yeah. Right. Well, if you ask it like that, yeah.
Right.
But yes, I think you make a good point. You know, yes. Again, I'm a firm believer that in our yeshivas we have the most remarkable human beings. You know, I look back fondly on all my hanhala. Sure, some more, some less, but you know, I'm a believer that the people we have working in our mistis are the best, and they're entrusted with our bachrim. And I'm sure the same is true with the girls. Let's see if we can give them tools to keep this conversation going, and to broach this new frontier, because I don't think that it's not needed. I think it certainly is needed. I think,
unfortunately, it's extremely needed.
Right. And so, you know, what if we could provide that as well?
So, in your opinion, a simple training program for mashpiyim, a simple question, like a simple template.
Yeah.
Have this conversation with somebody who you think might apply to.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the facts.
Right.
What does sexual abuse mean? What are some symptoms that you might see in a survivor of sexual abuse?
So, do you think educating the bachrim and kids first is important also? Meaning letting them know, like, there are certain things that happen that are just not okay?
That's a conversation which I, in a certain sense, I don't know if I feel like I have the authority on, because I'm not a mechanech.
Right.
And I'm not a mashpia. And I don't know how to speak to bachrim about a topic like this.
So I'll tell you why I'm asking, because I had a conversation on this podcast with a chassan teacher. And he sees, unfortunately, a lot of, because of the media people consume today and a lot of other factors, people go into marriage today with a lot of skewed ideas about intimacy and how, you know, and what it is and how it functions. And I asked him whether he thinks bachrim might benefit from a level of, again, that word, sex education. You know, obviously using, you know, but more intimacy education, the idea of how people are supposed to relate to their bodies and the opposite sex, and the idea of, you know, all of that. And whether, and he also wasn't willing to take on the authority to say we have to start doing this in yeshiva, but he thought it would help. So I'm not asking you to say we should do this in a certain way. Do you think it would help if there was some form of education for bachrim, and even younger maybe, to, you know, to be aware of their bodies and the way, you know, certain things can happen that are just not okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. You know, it's not a secret how I learned about sexual abuse from watching a TV episode.
Right.
That's kind of sad.
That's very sad.
I mean, yeah. There's got to be a way out there how to do it that blends, again, you know, the sensitivity and the ruchnius, and you know, not telling our kids all these things that they don't need to know at such a young age, while keeping them safe, keeping them aware. You know, we give bachrim chassan classes before they get married. We don't just, you know, throw them in the ring and be like, hey, go figure it out. Like, you know, you'll be fine. Like, you know, the human race has survived for God knows how many thousands of years now, so I'm sure you and her will, you know, figure it out together. We don't do that. We sit them down and we tell them, you know, klara deburim, this is what's going to happen and this is how it works, etc. Yeah, perhaps there's a way to, you know, have that conversation, again, not from a sexual connotation in terms of, you know,
right,
from an intimacy level, but you know, hello, young man. There's this thing called puberty. Your body is changing. Your mind is changing. Your hormones are changing. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about, your body and so on. A few weeks ago, I had a conversation with the Shliach. He had reached out right after the abuse. Yeah, this is the guy I'm pretty close with. So he says to me, he called to ask me for advice. Every summer, he goes with his kids to his in-laws. And near his in-laws, there's another Lubavitcher family that lives there, and the kids like playing with the kids. And he is very concerned that the father of this other family is up to no good. So he wants to tell his kids that they can't go and play in the other house, but the kids are welcome to go and play in their house. But how do you tell your kids that? So I said, well, I don't have a good answer for you, but let me think this through. Why don't you share with your kids that you feel uncomfortable? Why don't you have a conversation with your kids about uncomfortability, about feeling creeped out? So he said, I don't know if I could have a conversation like that with my kids. I said, maybe that's a problem. My kids are little. His kids are much older. My kids are 3 and 1. I don't know. I'd like to feel that when the time comes, I could tell my kids, I feel really uncomfortable around this person. This person makes me feel uncomfortable. Me, I'm a tati. You think I could fly. You think that I'm the greatest human being alive. Yet, that person makes me feel uncomfortable. How do you feel? Can you think of a person that makes you feel uncomfortable? The conversations need to change. And if we want to protect our kids from those kinds of things, we need to figure out ways to really bring nuance to these conversations that we never thought we'd have with our kids.
Well, yeah. the world sometimes limits our options and the kinds of conversations we have to start having.
Sure.
Okay, so if there was one practical change that just an actual thing, a program, just one, even a small thing, what would you do if you had the power to do that? Would it be in elementary school, Masifta, Zal, and what would it be?
I'd like to see it starting later and working its way backwards. I think that obviously 16-year-olds are more kalim to have this conversation than 14-year-olds and so on. I would love to see, my brother-in-law was my shadchan. So my brother-in-law was teaching in the smicha program where I was learning, and after the year was over, he called my would-be shviger, and suggested a shidduch, and we all lived happily ever after, Baruch Hashem. So I said to him after everything came out, I said, I got to be honest with you. I was very scared of you, particularly, especially smicha, marriage is coming, and it's a new phase in life, and so I got to ask you, if my 21-year-old self would have gone to you and said, hi, Rabbi Blankety, I was sexually abused as a kid, what would you have done? Right then in the moment.
Meaning, would you have read that shidduch?
No, forget that.
Okay, you're saying
we're sitting in the Nahal office, we're having a deep conversation, and I said to you, by the way, I've always wanted to tell you, I was sexually abused. Right there, that moment. You're the first person I've ever told. It's a huge moment in my life. How would you have reacted? What would you have done? And he's like, I have no idea. That's a problem. That's a very direct problem. That's a problem that I think we can tackle head on. I think it starts with our hanhalas, and then it trickles down to the bakram. Once there's a system in place of people who are ready to have this conversation with you, you need to be comfortable enough to go and bring that conversation to them, and you can rest assured that when you do that, there is a listening voice on the other end that knows how to handle this topic sensitively. But, I feel like this topic is one that it's like a bad itch that you itch it for a while and it really knows you I really should go and see a doctor. And you wake up the next morning and it's gone. No harm, no foul. I'm fine. And it's gone for a week. And then we get it comes out. I really get to go see a doctor, and then it goes away. I feel like we're tiptoeing around this issue, right. And ultimately that's all that I wanted to accomplish was stop tiptoeing. Take a good hard look. This is what it is. Are we ready to acknowledge that our community suffers from this problem as much as anybody else? Frum, Frei, Jews, Catholics, Muslims, Mormons, atheists, you name it. It's a common denominator. Everybody's got this. when we do that, which I think we're doing, and when we really do that properly, I think then, the natural reaction to that is that it behooves us to be ready to, acknowledge and accept a real lasting change.
Okay. So on that note, that's thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much for coming by. Thank you so much for speaking openly about this, not only to me but to other outlets. I hope that your story can make real positive change for people who've been suffering for too long.
Thanks, Shalom. I hope it does the same.
All right.
Appreciate
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Rabbi Zippel for coming on, and thank you for listening. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email at ChabadPulse@gmail.com or via the social media platform of your choice. And speaking of social media, please take a moment to like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That way you'll get the latest updates on what's going on with the show and what's coming up next. Down the line, there will even be ways to interact with the show by getting your questions featured in future interviews, so please get involved. And if you aren't subscribed to us yet, please do. You're missing out. Subscribing to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, or the podcast platform of your choice. And some of you, the fancy tech people out there who have custom RSS feeds, it's the easiest and simplest way to keep up with the show. It's the easiest way to listen to past and future episodes of the show. You get automatic updates. Just when the episode comes out, you get it. You don't have to go search for it. It's right there. Just press play. If you want to subscribe, just search ChabadPulse again on the platform of your choice, whether that's iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google Play or YouTube. And search ChabadPulse, no spaces, and just hit subscribe. It's as simple as that. The next episode is going to be after Pesach Hashem, and we're going to be meet at this time on a regular posting schedule throughout spring and summer, including the episodes we announced at the end of last episode. Complicated story, but they're coming out and on a regular schedule. As always, thanks for listening, and let's keep this conversation going.